The gavel fell like a gunshot. Sold. The word cracked through the oppressive heat of Millfield's Main Street, echoing off the false-fronted buildings and silencing the hungry buzz of the crowd. For Clara Hartwell, standing on the makeshift auction platform with her hands bound in coarse rope, the sound was the slam of a prison door. Her world already fractured, shattered into 1,000 pieces of dust and despair. Alkali dust, white and fine as a shroud, clung to the sweat on her face. Her Sunday dress, torn at the shoulder where her brother had dragged her from the family wagon, felt like a costume for a play she never wished to be in. Below her, the men of the town leaned forward, their faces a gallery of grim calculation and morbid curiosity. Their wives whispered behind gloved hands, their expressions a sickening mix of pity and fascination. "Now, gentlemen," her father's voice boomed from beside the auctioneer, a hearty salesman's tone that turned Clara's stomach to ice. "As I explained, this arrangement settles our family's debt completely. Clara is 22 strong as an ox can cook clean, bare children. And she's never been touched by another man. The winning bidder gets a wife and a worker guaranteed." Each word was a physical blow. Thomas Hartwell, the man who had once hoisted her onto his shoulders and called her his precious girl, now hawked her virtues like a horse trader. She scanned the crowd, a desperate silent plea in her eyes. She searched for a flicker of decency, a single soul who might object. Her mother stood near the back, a silhouette of grief tears carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, but she remained silent. Her brother Henry stared at the ground, his jaw set in the stubborn line that meant he had already made his peace with this monstrous act. The people she had known her entire life, the blacksmith, the store owner, the pastor's wife, watched their discomfort, a useless passive thing. No one moved. No one spoke. Until someone did. "This is wrong." The voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk, deep, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. Every head turned. Clara's heart leaped into her throat as she saw him. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his tall frame rigid with a controlled anger that seemed to radiate from him in waves. His dark eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, were fixed on her father with an intensity that made several men near him take an involuntary step back. As he moved forward, a sliver of sunlight caught something at Clara's throat. A small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. Jake's stride faltered for a fraction of a second. The world around him seemed to narrow to that single point of light. The locket was oval, etched with a pair of intertwined doves, identical to the one his mother had worn every day of her life. The one she'd been wearing when the earth swallowed her whole, the locket he had never found in the rubble. The sight was a key turning in a locked room of his memory, releasing a ghost he had spent years trying to bury. This was no longer just about a town's injustice. It was now a personal imperative, a command from the ghosts of his past. Thomas Hartwell's face darkened with indignation. "This is family business, Morrison. I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself." Jake didn't stop. His boots clicked a slow, deliberate rhythm on the dusty planks of the street. Family business doesn't usually involve putting your daughter up for auction like she's a prize heifer. What kind of debt could possibly justify this? The kind that's going to get my whole family killed if it's not paid. Thomas snapped, sweat beading on his upper lip. "We owe Marcus Blackwood $12,000, and he wants payment by sundown. Or he's coming for all of us. This is the only way." The name fell over the crowd like a winter shadow. Marcus Blackwood. He was the whispered threat mothers used to frighten their children, a moneylender and predator who controlled half the territory through a carefully cultivated ecosystem of fear and violence. Stories of what happened to those who defaulted on his loans were the stuff of local legend, each more gruesome than the last. The mention of his name made her father's desperation suddenly horribly understandable. But Jake Morrison didn't flinch. If anything, the set of his jaw grew harder. So you decided to sacrifice your daughter instead of facing your own mistakes like a man. The words were quiet, but they carried across the silent street like thunder. Thomas's face flushed a blotchy red. How dare you? How dare I? Jake's voice rose, the controlled anger now a palpable force. Clara could see the storm gathering in his eyes. How dare I point out that you're selling your own flesh and blood to save your worthless hide, that you're letting these vultures bid on her like she's property. The crowd grew restless. Some of the bidders muttered annoyed at the interruption. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous darting eyes, cleared his throat. Now, if we could just proceed. We're not proceeding with anything. Jake's command stopped the man cold. He walked to the base of the platform, his gaze lifting to meet Clara's. The chaos of the street seemed to fade away, the noise muted. For a heart-stopping moment, she felt as if they were the only two people in the world. He saw not the commodity her father described, but a person terrified and alone. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice softening just for her. "Do you want this? Do you want to be sold to one of these men?" Her throat was so tight she could barely draw breath, but she managed to shake her head, the movement sharp and frantic. "No," she whispered, then found her voice louder, clearer. "No, I don't want this. I never wanted this." Jake gave a single sharp nod. Then he turned his furious gaze back to her father. "Then, this ends now." In a motion born of pure panic, Thomas Hartwell drew a pistol, his hand shaking so badly, the barrel wavered. "You don't understand. Morrison Blackwood will kill us all, including Clara. At least this way, she has a chance at life." Jake didn't even glance at the gun. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the solid, undeniable sound of coins. $12,000, he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I'll pay Blackwood myself." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The silence that followed was so absolute that Clara could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart. Thomas stared at the pouch as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. You don't have that kind of money. Nobody in these parts has that kind of money." A cold, mirthless smile touched Jake's lips. "I've got more than you know what to do with, Hartwell. My mining claim up at Blackwood Sorrow has been paying off for years." He tossed the pouch onto the platform. It landed with a heavy final thud. "The question is, are you going to take my money and let your daughter go, or are you going to keep trying to sell her like cattle?" Hope, fierce and blinding, surged in Clara's chest. But it died just as quickly as she saw the expression on her father's face shift. The desperation drained away, replaced by the creeping, ugly stain of greed. "Wait just a minute," Thomas said slowly, lowering the pistol, but not holstering it. "If you've got $12,000 to throw around, maybe we need to renegotiate. Maybe the price for Clara just went up." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the onlookers. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her own father, in this moment of salvation, was still trying to profit from her degradation. Jake's expression became deadly calm. The anger was gone, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "Let me make something very clear, Hartwell," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "I'm offering to pay your debt. But if you think for 1 second you can use that to extort more money from me, you're about to learn a very hard lesson." He took another step forward. Several men in the crowd instinctively reached for their sidearms. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take my $12,000, you're going to untie your daughter, and you're going to walk away." Because the alternative is that I pay Blackwood the money myself. And then I explained to him exactly how you tried to sell your own daughter to avoid facing the consequences of your gambling. Thomas went pale. It was a well-known, if rarely spoken fact, that Marcus Blackwood was fiercely protective of his own daughter. The thought of what he might do to a man who treated his family as chattel was enough to make Thomas tremble. "You wouldn't," he whispered. Jake's smile was as sharp as a shard of glass. "Try me." For a long, tense moment, the two men locked gazes across the dusty street. Clara held her breath, terrified that any sound, any movement might shatter the fragile standoff. Finally, with a shuddering sigh of defeat, Thomas holstered his pistol and nodded to the auctioneer. "Untie her," he said, his voice hollow. "The auction's over." As the ropes fell from her wrists, Clara stumbled down from the platform, her legs weak with relief. Jake's hand reached for hers, warm and strong, and a feeling of safety, something she hadn't felt in weeks, washed over her. But as he led her away, she glanced back and saw her brother Henry's face in the crowd. The expression there, a toxic brew of rage, humiliation, and a promise of future retribution, made her blood run cold. She had a terrible feeling that this was far from over. Her father's voice, raw with impotent fury, called after them. "This isn't over, Morrison. You think Blackwood won't find out what really happened here? You've made powerful enemies today, and Clara's going to pay for it." Clara looked up at Jake's stoic profile as they walked toward his horse. She saw the tight line of his jaw, the way his free hand rested near the butt of his pistol. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" He stopped and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious, but not unkind. "I've done what needed doing. And whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." Relief flooded through her, but it was tinged with a deep, unsettling dread. She had been saved from one nightmare, only to feel them both walking directly into another one, far darker and more dangerous than either of them could possibly imagine. Jake's ranch was a fortress, carved from the wilderness, nestled in a high valley between two jagged mountain ridges. The sun-scorched badlands stretched below a cracked and barren canvas, where the heat shimmered above the earth and distant mesas burned orange against an endless turquoise sky. The isolation was both a comfort and a threat. As they rode up the winding rocky trail, Clara found herself studying the man who had shattered his quiet life for her. He rode with an easy confidence, a man at home in this harsh landscape. Yet she saw the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. For months he had been a ghost in her life, the reclusive rancher who came to town for supplies, his face a mask of quiet sorrow, his past a subject of vague and tragic town gossip. She knew only that his wealth came from an old silver claim, and that some terrible accident had taken his family years ago. Now this ghost had become her protector. "Jake," she said, breaking the long silence, "you barely know me. Why did you do it? Why risk so much for a stranger?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, weighted with an emotion he fought to conceal. "Because a man's debts are his own, not his daughter's. And because I saw the locket." The locket, she touched the familiar silver oval at her throat. It had been her grandmother's. "My mother had one just like it." He said, his gaze distant. "She was wearing it the day the mine collapsed. I never found it." He cleared his throat, pushing the memory away. "Seeing it on you, it felt like a sign, a debt I had to pay." Before Clara could process the strange, fateful weight of his words, Jake reined in his horse, his body instantly alert. He held up a hand for silence. They were at the crest of a hill overlooking his ranch, a modest house, a solid barn, a corral, holding a few fine horses and pastures that swept toward the mountains. But what made an icy dread coil in Clara's stomach was the thin plume of smoke rising from the porch of the house. "Someone's here," Jake said grimly, his voice flat and hard. He spurred his horse into a gallop. The smoke came from a small, deliberately set fire on his porch, a signal of intrusion. But it was the man sitting in Jake's rocking chair smoking a thin cigar, as if he owned the valley, who made Jake curse under his breath. Marcus Blackwood was a man of chilling precision. Tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that defied the dust and heat, with silver hair that gleamed in the sun and eyes like chips of winter ice. He smiled as they rode up a placid reptilian expression devoid of warmth. Jake Morrison Blackwood called out, his voice smooth and cultured. "I must say I'm impressed. It's not often a man introduces such an invasive species into my carefully managed ecosystem." Jake dismounted, moving to stand protectively in front of Clara. His hand rested on the worn leather of his gun belt. "The debt's paid, Blackwood. Your business with the Hartwells is concluded." Blackwood laughed, a dry rustling sound. "The monetary debt, yes. That is settled. But you, Mr. Morrison, have created a new, far more interesting liability. A reputational one." He stood, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Word of your theatrics has already spread. The reclusive rancher with a fortune in silver playing the knight in shining armor. People are starting to ask questions. They're starting to wonder if the fear I've so carefully cultivated is perhaps a renewable resource. That is bad for business. Very bad." He took a step closer, and Clara instinctively shrank behind Jake's solid form. The air crackled with unspoken violence. "That's not my problem," Jake said, his voice level. "Oh, but it is," Blackwood replied softly. "Because you are going to fix it. You will take Miss Hartwell back to town. You will publicly renounce your interference, and you will allow her father to settle his affairs as he sees fit." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. When Jake spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Over my dead body." Blackwood's smile widened. "That can certainly be arranged." From the shadows of the barn, two men emerged, rifles held at a casual but ready angle. Before Clara could blink, Jake's pistol was in his hand, aimed squarely at Blackwood's heart. Now, Blackwood chided gently. "No need for such unpleasantness. Not yet." "Jake," Clara whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Please just do what he says. I'm not worth dying for." Jake never took his eyes off Blackwood. "You're wrong about that." The simple, unadorned conviction in his voice struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Blackwood simply laughed again. How touching. "But love, Mr. Morrison, makes men weak. It makes them predictable." He gestured to his men. "Last chance." Clara couldn't bear it. She stepped out from behind Jake, her hands trembling but her chin held high. "Wait, I'll go back. Just don't hurt him." Clara knew Jake's command was fierce, but she ignored it. "This is my choice," she said, her heart breaking at the anguish on his face. This good, brave man would die for her, and she could not let that happen. She faced Blackwood. "I'll go back willingly, but you give him safe passage. He leaves the territory with his money, and you never bother him again." Blackwood considered her, a flicker of genuine amusement in his cold eyes. "An interesting offer. But I believe I have a better one." He holstered his own pistol, a gesture of absolute confidence. "Here is my counter-proposal. You, Mr. Morrison, can keep the girl, but you will work for me." The blood drained from Clara's face. "Work for you?" "Precisely," Blackwood said, his sharp smile returning. "You have a certain talent for inspiring fear and respect. I could use a man like that. You will become my enforcer. You will collect my debts, discourage troublemakers, and protect my interests. A career change, if you will. Jake's gun didn't waver. I'll never work for a man like you. Oh, but you will. Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Because if you refuse, I will not simply kill Miss Hartwell. I will sell her to a place in the territories where pretty girls with fight in their eyes fetch a high price. I will ensure she suffers in ways that will curdle your dreams for the rest of your very short life. And then, when you are thoroughly broken, I will kill you anyway. Just for the principle of it. Clara saw the trap snap shut. She saw the fight drain from Jake's eyes, replaced by a bleak, horrifying acceptance. Blackwood had found his one unbreakable point of leverage, her safety. And they both knew Jake would sacrifice his own soul to guarantee it. How do I know you'll keep your word? Jake asked, his voice hollow. Blackwood shrugged, a picture of casual cruelty. You don't, but it's the only chance she has. The standoff stretched the silence, broken only by the wind whistling down from the high peaks. Clara could see the war raging behind Jake's eyes. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He slowly, deliberately lowered his gun. If I agree, he said, each word tasting like ash, Clara stays here, on this ranch, safe, untouched. That is not negotiable. Done. Blackwood agreed instantly, his smile triumphant. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. Welcome to the organization, Jake Morrison, he said, his voice laced with silken poison. I have a feeling this is the beginning of a very profitable partnership. As Blackwood and his men rode away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake, Clara felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to brace herself against Jake's horse. She had been saved from the auction block only to become the gilded cage for the man who had freed her. Jake, she whispered, reaching for him, I'm so sorry. Don't, he said sharply, pulling away from her touch as if it burned him. The distance between them was suddenly a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He wouldn't look at her, couldn't look at her, because she was the living, breathing symbol of his damnation. He walked toward the house, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his new chains. Clara watched him go, a terrible thought, taking root in her mind. Perhaps her father had been right. Some prices were simply too high to pay. The next 3 weeks were a slow, agonizing descent into hell. Jake would leave before sunrise, a silent specter moving through the pre-dawn gloom, and return long after dark, his face a mask carved from stone, his clothes often torn or stained with the blood of other men. He never spoke of what Blackwood made him do, but Clara saw the truth in the haunted emptiness of his eyes. The quiet, decent man who had saved her was being systematically erased, replaced by a hard, cold enforcer who flinched at her touch. She tried to fight the darkness encroaching on their lives. She cooked meals he barely ate, mended clothes that were ruined again the next day, filled the small house with wildflowers. She tried to make his home a sanctuary, a reminder of the man he was. But it was like trying to build a dam against a flood with her bare hands. He was slipping away, and his cold distance was a wall meant to protect her. But it felt like a punishment. On the 22nd day, he didn't come home at all. Clara paced the floor all night, the silence of the remote ranch pressing in on her, each creak of the floorboards, a premonition of disaster. By dawn, a frantic certainty had taken hold. She could not sit here safe in the prison he had bought with his soul while he was out there possibly dying. She saddled his spare horse and rode for Millfield, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found him in a filthy alley behind the general store. He was slumped against a wall, barely conscious, his face a swollen mess of cuts and bruises. His knuckles were raw, his shirt torn open to reveal the dark, ugly mottling of bruises across his ribs. But it was his eyes that broke her heart. They were vacant, defeated, as if the last flicker of his spirit had finally been extinguished. "Jake," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. She gently wiped the blood from his face with her handkerchief. "Oh, Jake, what did they make you do?" He groaned, trying to sit up. "Clara, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "I don't care about safe," she said fiercely, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I care about you, about what this is doing to you." For the first time in weeks, as she cupped his bruised cheek, he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a shudder racking his body. "There's no other way," he rasped, his voice a flat, hopeless monotone. "I tried to run. His men caught me at the county line. They made it very clear what would happen to you if I tried again." He closed his eyes. "Clara, the things I've done, I hurt people. Good people. I'm not the man who saved you anymore." "You're wrong," she said softly, her forehead resting against his. "You are still the man who stood up for me. You're still the man who chose my safety over his own freedom. That will never change." She took a shaky breath. "And I love you for it. I love you so much, it terrifies me." His eyes snapped open. In their desolate depths, a tiny flame flickered to life. Hope. Disbelief. "Clara, you can't love me. Not what I've become. I know exactly who I love." She insisted, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her own cheeks. "I love the man who is suffering to keep me safe. And I'm not going to let you destroy yourself for me anymore." Footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Marcus Blackwood appeared, flanked by his men, his expression one of cold amusement. "How touching," he said smoothly. "True love in the gutter. Though I must say, Jake, you look dreadful. I take it the Schmidt brothers were not pleased about losing their family store." Clara's horror was a physical shock. The Schmidts had 3 young children. "You made him burn down their store." She choked out, her voice rising with outrage. Blackwood shrugged. They were behind on their loan. Business is business. He turned his attention to Jake. "And your workday isn't over. The Henderson farm 5 miles north. They owe $800. I want you to persuade them to pay." Clara's blood ran to ice. The Hendersons were an elderly couple raising their sick granddaughter, Lucy. Clara had been taking them food from Jake's pantry for weeks. "No, Jake, please," she begged. But Jake was already pushing himself to his feet, his movements stiff and robotic. As he staggered out of the alley, Blackwood's men blocked Clara's path. "I'm afraid our arrangement requires a slight adjustment," Blackwood said, his voice like silk sliding over a razor's edge. "You'll be accompanying me today. A little insurance, shall we say? I find Jake is far more motivated when he has a clear and present reminder of exactly what he stands to lose." Forced onto a horse. Clara watched Jake's retreating back, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She had been a passive victim for too long. She had watched the man she loved be dismantled piece by bloody piece for her sake. No more. As they rode out of town, a new hard resolve began to form in her heart. Love wasn't about being protected. It was about protecting in return. It was time to fight back. The Henderson farm smelled of wood smoke and despair. The barn, the family's livelihood, was a smoldering ruin. Old Tom Henderson stood with his arm around his wife Martha, their faces masks of numb shock. Their 10-year-old granddaughter Lucy, a frail girl with a persistent cough, clung to her grandmother's skirt. Jake stood apart from the destruction, the torch he'd used still in his hand, his face a carefully blank canvas. "Excellent work," Jake Blackwood called out as he and Clara rode up. He dismounted and approached Tom. "I trust this clarifies the urgency of your situation. Noon tomorrow." Tom looked past Blackwood, his eyes full of betrayed confusion fixed on Jake. "Jake Morrison, your father and I were friends. How could you?" Clara saw Jake flinch, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Pay your debts, Tom," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the smoldering barn. Then the unthinkable happened. Little Lucy Henderson let go of her grandmother's dress and walked straight up to Jake. She looked up at him, her large, solemn eyes holding not fear, but a profound sadness. "Mr. Jake," she said, her voice raspy from her illness, "my mama told me stories about you. She said you were the kindest man in the territory. She said you were a hero." She reached out her small, thin hand and took his. "But you're not helping us now, are you?" The careful mask on Jake's face shattered. Raw anguish contorted his features. For a moment, Clara thought he would break, thought the real Jake Morrison would finally claw his way out from the wreckage. But Blackwood's voice sliced through the tension. "Mr. Morrison has new priorities now. Don't you, Jake?" Jake pulled his hand from Lucy's, taking a step back, as if her innocent touch was a brand. "Pay the debt," he repeated, his voice hollow. He turned away, his shoulders shaking with a sob he refused to release. And Clara snapped. "Stop!" she cried, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. She slid from her horse and strode to the center of the yard, placing herself between Jake and the family he had just devastated. "This has gone far enough." Blackwood raised a placid eyebrow. "Miss Hartwell, this is hardly the time for dramatics." "You're right," Clara said, turning to face him, a terrifying calm settling over her. "It's time for a deal." The words hung in the smoky air. Even Blackwood looked momentarily startled. "A deal? And what could you possibly have to offer me?" Clara lifted her chin. She was no longer a victim. She was a player in the game. "I'm wagering myself, my freedom, against yours." The silence was profound. "I challenge you to a bet. Winner takes all." Blackwood's initial surprise melted into condescending amusement. He dismounted, circling her like a wolf studying its prey. "A bet," he repeated slowly. "And what, pray tell, are the stakes?" "If I lose," Clara said, her voice unwavering despite the tremor in her hands, "I am yours to command. Marry me off, send me away. Put me to work in one of your establishments, whatever you desire. Jake goes free. The Hendersons keep their farm. All debts in this territory are forgiven, except for mine, which I will work to pay for the rest of my life." Jake stepped forward, his face a mask of horror. "Clara, no, this is insane." She ignored him, her eyes locked on Blackwood. "And if I win," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "Jake is released from his service to you. All debts are forgiven, and you pack up your entire operation and leave this territory, never to return." Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. A tempting, if ludicrous, proposition. But what is the contest? A baking competition. "I'm betting I can do something you've never managed, for all your power and fear," Clara said, meeting his mocking gaze. "I'm betting that I can unite every single person in this territory against you. Not with violence or threats, but with their own free will. I bet I can make them stand up together and show you that they are no longer afraid." The amusement vanished from Blackwood's face, replaced by a calculating gleam. He saw the trap. To refuse was to admit he believed she could succeed. To accept was to risk everything on the conviction that fear was, and always would be, the ultimate ruler of men. "You have 24 hours, he said finally, his voice soft and menacing. "By sunset tomorrow, if you can orchestrate this collective act of courage, I will honor your terms. But when you fail, and you will fail, your debt will come due." As Blackwood and his men rode off, the full crushing weight of her gamble settled upon Clara. She had just wagered her entire future on the courage of a terrified and broken community. "Clara, what have you done?" Jake's voice was ragged with despair. "These people are terrified. They won't risk everything for us." "Not for us, Jake," she said, turning to him, her eyes blazing with a desperate fire he hadn't seen before. "For their children. For a chance to live without looking over their shoulder." She looked at the Hendersons, who were staring at her with a dawning, fragile hope. "Mr. Henderson, if you absolutely knew that every other family would stand with you, would you do it?" Tom looked at his wife, then at his granddaughter, her small form racked with another cough. "If I knew we weren't standing alone," he said slowly, for Lucy to grow up without this shadow over her. "Yes, I'd stand." Jake was still shaking his head. "That man is gone, Clara. The one who stood up for you. Look at what I've done. No one will follow me." "You're wrong," Martha Henderson said suddenly, her voice surprisingly firm. She walked to Jake and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We see the difference between a man who chooses evil and a man trapped by it. Your father was a good man, Jake Morrison. Good men raise good sons, even when those sons get lost in the dark for a while." Clara saw something shift in Jake's eyes. A flicker of the man, he was a spark of the hero Lucy believed him to be. The enforcer's mask began to crack. "What's the plan?" he asked quietly, the first note of hope in his voice in weeks. Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like a memory of a forgotten language. "Blackwood controls people by keeping them isolated. He makes them believe they're alone in their fear. We're going to prove him wrong. At exactly noon tomorrow, when the church bell tolls, every family in this territory is going to do one simple public thing. They're going to step outside and take down his notices from their doors and fences." Martha's eyes lit up. A signal, a silent protest. "Exactly," Clara said, excitement building in her voice. "He can't stop them all at once. And when each family sees their neighbors doing the same thing, they'll know they're not alone. Courage is contagious, Jake. We just have to start the infection." "But how do we get word to everyone?" Jake asked, the practical reality setting in. 24 hours isn't enough time. Clara thought of the quilting circles, the church socials, the years she had spent building a network of trust and friendship throughout the territory. "Leave that to me," she said. "But I need you. I need the man I love to ride with me and remind people what courage looks like." For the first time since Blackwood's arrival, Jake met her gaze, and she saw not the broken enforcer, but the man who had bought her freedom. He took her hand, his grip firm and sure. "All right, Clara," he said. "Let's go start a revolution." They rode through the night, a pair of ghosts carrying a dangerous spark of hope. The hours blurred into a frantic race against the sun. At each farm, each isolated homestead, they were met with fear, with slammed doors and whispered warnings. But for every refusal, there were others who listened, their eyes widening as they grasped the elegant simplicity of the plan. The Hendersons had been the first domino. By sunrise, 42 others had agreed to fall with them. As dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, Clara and Jake stood on the porch of his ranch, exhausted but united. The doubt, however, was a cold knot in Clara's stomach. 43 families. Was it enough? Just then they heard the sound of approaching riders. Jake's hand went to his gun, but as the figures grew clearer, Clara gasped. It was her brother Henry, and behind him, their father, his face etched with a shame so profound it seemed to have aged him a decade. They were not alone. A dozen other men from town rode with them. Clara, Henry said, dismounting, his voice thick with emotion. "We heard what you're doing. We were wrong, all of us." Thomas Hartwell stepped forward, unable to meet her eyes. "What I did to you, it was the act of a coward. Seeing you stand up to him. You showed more courage in 1 minute than I've shown in my entire life. We want to help, if you'll have us." Clara stared at her father, at the men behind him, the shopkeepers and farmers who had stood by and watched her humiliation. She saw not the cowards they had been, but the men they wanted to be. "We're already in, her father said finally, looking at her, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "And we've been spreading the word. The number isn't 43 families anymore, Clara. It's 78, and growing." By mid-morning, Jake's ranch was a bustling camp of quiet rebellion. People came from every corner of the territory, drawn by the incredible, audacious whisper of hope. At 11:55, Clara and Jake rode into the eerily quiet town. They watched the church bell tower, their hearts pounding in time with the ticking clock. Noon. The first bell tolled, its bronze voice echoing across the silent landscape. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Clara's heart sank. 4, 5, 6. The silence stretched taut and unbearable. 7, 8, 9. Then a single door opened. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, stepped onto her porch and methodically tore a collection notice from her door, crumpling it in her fist. A moment later, another door opened. Then another, and another. Like a silent, inexorable flood, the people of the territory emerged. From farmhouses and storefronts, from cottages and workshops, they stepped into the sunlight. They tore down the symbols of their oppression, their movements not angry, but deliberate, dignified. It was a collective, unified exhalation and the sigh of a people who had decided as one to no longer be afraid. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she watched the impossible happen. They had done it. They had won the bet. But as joy surged through her, a cold dread followed. Men like Marcus Blackwood did not accept defeat gracefully. The bet was won, but the war was just beginning. Blackwood rode into town an hour later, his face a mask of controlled fury, his dozen men fanning out behind him, their hands on their guns. The townsfolk who had been standing in the street, a testament to their new unity, slowly retreated to their doorways, watching, waiting. "I must admit," Miss Hartwell Blackwood said, his voice dangerously calm as he dismounted before Clara and Jake. "I'm impressed. A truly inspiring display of communal folly." He gestured to the littered street. "Completely pointless, of course." "It's not pointless," Clara said, her voice steady. "You've lost. Your power was fear, and the fear is gone." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "My dear girl, fear is never gone. It merely sleeps." He turned, his cold eyes sweeping over the watchful faces in the doorways. "I'm going to make an example of the Hendersons. Then perhaps the Millers. A few tragic accidents, and this fleeting courage of yours will evaporate like morning dew." His men started forward, but then Tom Henderson stepped back into the street, his hands empty, his face serene. He walked directly toward Blackwood. "I want to thank you, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and strong. Blackwood paused, confused. "Thank me?" "Yes," Tom said, "for reminding me what it feels like to be a man. I'd rather die standing up today than live another year on my knees. As if on cue, Henry stepped out. Then Martha Henderson. Then the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the pastor. One by one, then in groups, then the people emerged from the shadows, forming a silent human wall in the center of the street. They were unarmed, unthreatening, but their collective presence was a force more powerful than any gun. They stood between Blackwood and his intended victims, their message clear. You will have to kill all of us. Blackwood's men slowed their certainty, faltering. They were thugs, not soldiers. They could terrorize a single family, but the prospect of massacring an entire town gave even them pause. Rage finally cracked Blackwood's icy composure. This was a rebellion he couldn't shoot, a defiance he couldn't break. His power was an illusion, and they had all just opened their eyes. In a spasm of fury, he lunged for the one person responsible. He grabbed Clara, pulling her from Jake's side and dragging her toward the half-finished skeleton of the new church at the edge of town. You wanted to unite them, girl, he snarled, shoving her ahead of him. Let them watch you die. At that moment, the sky, which had been darkening all afternoon, broke open. A clap of thunder rattled the very foundations of the town, and rain began to fall in cold, hard sheets. The final confrontation had begun. The half-built church was a cage of raw timber open to the storm. Wind howled through the rafters, and rain lashed through the unsecured window frames. Lightning bleached the scene in stark, dramatic flashes, followed by immediate, deafening thunder. Blackwood shoved Clara against a stack of lumber and turned to face Jake, who had followed him into the chaotic structure. This is your fault. Morrison Blackwood roared over the storm, his elegant facade stripped away to reveal the raw hatred beneath. You and your father, always interfering, always believing you were better than everyone else. Jake moved cautiously, his body coiled, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. This has nothing to do with my father. It has everything to do with him. Blackwood screamed, his voice cracking with a grief that was years old and festering. He killed them. My wife, my little girl. He killed them both at that silver claim of yours. Jake froze. The name of his claim, Blackwood's Sorrow, suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. His nightmares of rumbling earth and a woman's scream were not his own. They were an echo of a tragedy that had soaked this land in blood. It was an accident, Jake said, the words catching in his throat. A structural collapse. It was murder, Blackwood spat. He knew the silver vein was unstable, but he was greedy. He triggered the collapse to hide his find, burying my family alive to protect his profits. I've spent 15 years planning my revenge. This town, the debts, it was all just a stage. A way to draw you out, to isolate you, to turn you into the same kind of monster your father was before I destroyed you. He lunged, and the fight was not one of skill, but of pure, brutal desperation. They crashed through stacks of wood, their fists landing with wet, ugly thuds. The storm raged around them, a mirror of the violence within. Blackwood was stronger, fueled by years of venomous rage. He gained the upper hand, pinning Jake to the muddy ground, his hands closing around Jake's throat. You'll die knowing you're no better than him. He hissed, his face inches from Jake's. No, Clara's shriek cut through the howl of the wind. She scrambled up from the lumber pile, clutching a weathered, leather-bound book she had pulled from a box of town records she'd been studying. He's lying. Jake's father wasn't responsible. Blackwood turned his head, his grip momentarily loosening. What? I found it this morning. Clara cried, her voice rising with desperate conviction. The original surveyor's report for the mine. There was a geological fault line, unstable and prone to collapse. Your family's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder. Blackwood stared at her, his mind refusing to accept it. A lie, a trick, "It's not a lie," Clara's voice broke with a sob. "The report, it was witnessed. By a second party. A man who knew about the fault and said nothing. A man who owed you money, even back then. A gambling debt he couldn't pay." A flash of lightning illuminated her face. Her features twisted in anguish and shame. Her gaze fell on the church doorway where her father stood soaked to the bone, his face a landscape of utter desolation. "It was you," Jake choked out, looking from Clara to the man in the doorway. Thomas Hartwell nodded, the movement barely perceptible. Tears mixed with the rain on his face. "I knew," he whispered, his voice lost in the storm. "I knew the mine was unsafe. But I was in debt to him. He threatened me. I stayed silent, and his family died." The truth landed in the center of the church with the force of a lightning strike. It shattered everyone. Blackwood's hands fell from Jake's throat. The vendetta that had defined his entire adult life, the righteous fury that had fueled him for 15 years, was built on a lie. The man he had hated was innocent. And the man responsible for his family's death was the pathetic, sniveling coward whose debt had started this entire chain of events. He stared at Thomas Hartwell, not with hatred, but with a vast, empty horror. His life's work was a meaningless, tragic mistake. Jake pushed himself up, the weight of his father's supposed guilt lifting from his shoulders, only to be replaced by the sickening realization of the Hartwell's betrayal. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the sudden ringing silence, the town sheriff, a man who had spent years looking the other way, stepped into the church, his pistol held steady. He looked at the broken man, who had once been Marcus Blackwood. "It's over," the sheriff said, his voice quiet but firm. Blackwood didn't resist. A hollowed-out shell, he allowed himself to be led away into the clean, rain-washed air. His reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating implosion of a terrible truth. Months later, the scars on the land and its people had begun to heal. The half-finished church was now a proper schoolhouse, its construction a symbol of the community's shared future. Thomas Hartwell, having confessed his role in the old tragedy, worked tirelessly, seeking atonement not in words, but in deeds. His relationship with Clara and Henry was a fragile, tender thing being carefully rebuilt on the foundation of a painful truth. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jake and Clara rode up the winding trail to the site of the old mine, Blackwood's Sorrow. The entrance was long collapsed, marked only by a pile of weathered stones and a few wind-stunted pines. Nearby, under the largest tree, were 2 unmarked graves. Clara, her form softened by the early stages of pregnancy, stood quietly as Jake approached the graves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small objects. The first was a smooth, flat stone he had taken from his father's old pocket watch. The second was the tarnished silver locket, his mother's locket, which Clara had given to him after the storm, a piece of his past finally returned. He knelt and placed them gently on the earth above the graves of the woman and child, whose deaths had caused so much pain. It was not an act of forgiveness for Blackwood, but for himself, for his father, for the breaking of a long and terrible cycle of vengeance. He was not defined by his father's legacy, nor by Blackwood's hatred. He was defined by his own choices. He stood and wrapped his arm around Clara, pulling her close. They looked down from the ridge at the valley spread below them. They saw the town of Millfield no longer a place of fear, but a community of survivors, architects of a new beginning, built not on secrets, but on truth. Their future and the future of their child lay waiting for them in the valley below, peaceful and promising under the vast open sky.